Hey guys, Chad Wesley Smith here for Juggernaut Training Systems. Today we're going to continue our series on the scientific principles of strength training with principle number 5, variation. So variation at its core is really just shocking the muscle. You may know it as muscle confusion if you're familiar with P90X infomercials. But variation is slightly more complex than that, but as bro science-y as muscle confusion sounds, that is part of the idea. So the definition of the principle of variation is the manipulation of training variables to prevent injury and staleness to magnify a long-term training effect or a long-term adaptive response to training. So it's going to be strategically using different exercises, different loading strategies to prevent the body from accommodating too quickly and the rate of gains ceasing. So while a lot of different factors in training are important, hypertrophy, general strength, peaking, low reps, high intensity, submaximal intensity, different types of exercises, all of those have their place. What properly applied variation is going to make that look like is that the timing of those is going to be maybe what's most important rather than just variation for sake of variation. So it's first important that we define this idea of adaptive resistance. Adaptive resistance is the body's slowing ability to adapt to new stimulus it's presented with. And a very important concept to understanding adaptive resistance is the idea of a negative feedback loop. And a negative feedback loop, more practical example that we can give you of that is that the more you eat, the less hungry you become. And the same idea is going to hold true in training. The more you do something, the less effective that something is going to become. The more you train high reps, the less effective high reps are going to become. The more you train singles, the less effective singles are going to become. The more you train a specific variation, the less effective that specific variation is going to be. So adaptive response dampens with continued exposure to the same stimulus. But we need to balance that out, and we need to balance all of variation out with two very important concepts. Principle number 1, the most important idea to our training, specificity, which creates a framework to everything. And then the idea of directed adaptation. And I talked about directed adaptation in the principle of overload video, but real quickly, directed adaptation is pretty much just doing enough of the same thing so you develop skill in it, so you can create some real output in it, and so you can actually tell if it's having its desired effect. So you have to balance out directed adaptation with adaptive response. Because while you just look at adaptive response, that might tell you I need to change all the time, because every time I don't change, that exercise is losing some of its effect. Well, if you change too frequently, you're going to violate directed adaptation, which is a higher priority principle. And as you run out of exercise to change to, you're definitely going to violate specificity with that. And specificity is the most important factor in effective program creation. So there are 4 main factors to the training that we're going to try and develop. And as adaptive response comes into play and is dampened through continued exposure, we're going to have to manipulate. So first is technique. Technique, there's really 3 stages to learning technique. That first stage is going from having essentially no technique, no exposure to a movement, to having okay technique. And that tends to be a pretty difficult thing for people to kind of get that first time the technique clicks for them, and they can go from just knock-kneed, wobbling, unstable squats to something that looks decent. Once they get to that point, it's pretty easy for them to go from decent technique to good technique. But then to go from good technique to great technique to perfect technique, optimal technique for that individual, is a much more challenging process. And that is because of adaptive resistance. As they do the exercise more and more and more, less improvements are to be made through continually doing it. So that's where variation is going to come into play. And introducing exercise variations that are similar enough to the competitive exercise to still create directed adaptation and specificity to it, but different enough so that it's some novel stimulus that, if your bench press technique is stalling, that you take out the competition bench press for a number of weeks and substitute in close grip, wide grip, spoto press, maybe incline bench, that when you go back to the competition bench press, it has some novel stimulus to it again. So you're entering in more at that, going from okay to good technique, like reintroducing that part of the learning process. And it's probably giving you some time in those weeks away from the exercise to kind of form a new relationship with the cues, to think about your technique differently. Hypertrophy dampens with adaptive resistance. That's going to be because different exercise variations target specific muscle fibers slightly differently than other exercise variations. So, it might affect a certain part of your quad more, squatting high bar than front squatting. And as you high bar week after week after week, maybe month after month after month, it could lead to localized overreaching of that specific musculature. So overreaching your MRV, your maximum recoverable volume, which if you want to learn more about that, make sure to refer to our fatigue management video. But as those muscles that are specifically the drivers of whatever exercise you're doing become overreached, then maybe you're not going to be able to continue to add volume, which in the case of hypertrophy is what's going to drive the adaptive response, which is going to drive hypertrophic gains, is continually increasing volume. But as those specific muscles that allow you to actually perform that exercise effectively become overreached, then you're not going to be able to continue to add volume. So that would be an appropriate time to make an exercise change and introduce some variation. Next is going to be neural strength. Neural strength is going to be when you're performing singles, you're performing high power movements, things like sprinting, jumping, true plyometrics, maybe Olympic lifting for other sports, but staying within the context of powerlifting, it's going to be doing, pretty much all out max singles. And we talk about this a lot in our critique of the Bulgarian system with Max Ada and I, and Max is a perfect example of adaptive resistance to neural strength. And almost anyone who's done a squat every day type of program for an extended period of time can probably give you at least some anecdotal evidence to the same idea happening to them. Max said in the first 6 weeks of training his front squat to maximum every single day, multiple times per day, his front squat went from 165 to 217 kilos in only 6 weeks. It then took him the remainder of the year, another 46 weeks, to increase his front squat another 13 kilos. If that is not a perfect example of adaptive resistance, I don't know what is. So that's when you can't just load it maximally, the most neurally stressful loading strategy, 1 rep max, over and over and over, because those neural qualities, besides having the longest SRA curves, which again refer to our video on the principle of SRA, stimulus recovery adaptation, for more information about that. But not only do you have the longest SRA curves, it's also incredibly low variation. It is almost always the competitive exercise over and over and over, and your body is going to accommodate to that, and you're just not going to be able to milk the neural qualities of strength out anymore. So that's when maybe you have to take a step back and focus on a different physical quality like hypertrophy, so then you can build a bigger muscle and then maybe go back to that highly neural training of singles, but now be able to have more muscle to move that weight as you continue to improve the neural adaptations. Finally, connective tissue. Your tissue integrity is going to be an important reason that you need to introduce some variation. Because if you do the same exercise loaded the same way over and over and over again, it's going to happen along the same lines of compression and tension, and that's what's going to potentially lead to things like overuse injuries if you have no exercise variation. So creating some balance and variation of the training program there is going to be very, very important to staying healthy. So you need to change the exercises, some degree of change frequently enough to just introduce new lines of compression and tension and help yourself avoid injury so you can train hard for the long term. There are 3 main ways that we create variation. First, loading strategy. So that's going to be sets and reps that you're doing and the intensity that you're doing the exercises at. The most specific exercise that you can do is the competition lift for a 1 rep maximum. So any change to that idea of 1 rep maximum is going to be some degree of variation. Two reps is variation compared to 1 rep. 3 reps, 4 reps, so on and so forth. With the higher rep schemes you get, the greater degree of variation you're going to be experiencing. Next, exercise selection. And that's probably how most people think of the concept of variation, is doing a new exercise all the time. It's very, very important to understand that as we work within the framework of specificity, the most important principle, that our exercise selection can become too broad and violate the principle of specificity. So while variation is important, specificity is more important. So when choosing different exercises to create variation, you need to work fairly close to the actual competitive exercise. And the more advanced the athlete is, the smaller degrees of variation are going to be effective for them in helping them continue to adapt and make gains to the training that they're presented with. So a more beginner athlete can do broader exercise variations and still get some good transfer, but more advanced athletes are going to make fairly small changes to exercise selection. For myself personally, I'm really rotating my squat between my competition squat, high bar squat, sometimes safety squat bar, and then different pauses or different tempos to the movement. That brings us to our third point that we can change and create variation. That's tempo and velocity of the lift. So doing a lift intentionally slow, whether that's a slow eccentric and then explosive in the concentric, controlled in both, pauses at the bottom, halfway up, halfway down, wherever it may be. All of those are another way to create variation. And as you combine these different loading strategies, different exercises, different tempos, you really have a potentially huge exercise pool to choose from and create variation. If you want to learn more about exercise selection as it relates to qualification of the lifter, please refer to my article, The Pyramid of Strength, which at its real quick synopsis of it is that you have a pyramid, and at the bottom it's very broad, the lowest qualification, very broad pool of exercises that's going to be effective. And then as you move up the pyramid, so you get higher in qualification, you also get more focused in exercise selection and what needs to be done. That's why you see athletes like Andrei Milanichev or Ilya Ilyin using extremely specific training protocols, but considering it's probably not Andrei Milanichev and Ilya Ilyin that are watching these videos, but if you are, hi guys, thanks for watching, then you need to look at the training that they did to get there, not the training that they're currently doing as the best lifters in the world. So that's a very, very important concept to understand. Do what those athletes did to get there, not what they're currently doing, and what they did to get there is going to be some degree of greater variation, but again, still framed within the context of specificity. So to summarize, we really have 3 ways that we can look at variation: an under application of it, an over application, or proper application. So under application, failure to properly apply variation, to use enough variation, is going to lead to staleness, just a slowing of gains from a physiological sense, and from a psychological sense, you're probably just going to get really bored with what you're doing. You won't develop other physical qualities. So if all you're doing is pushing for neural strength and doing single, you're not going to develop hypertrophy and general strength. If all you're doing is pushing for hypertrophy and you're doing high rep, continual bodybuilding style training, cycle after cycle after cycle, you might, not only is your progress going to slow there, you're also not going to take advantage of the other qualities, general strength and peaking, and improving the weight that you can actually lift. So then you can come back to hypertrophy training and do it with a heavier weight, which is only going to make it more effective. Also, under application of variation is going to cause your weaknesses to stay weak. If all you do is the competitive exercise and your triceps are lagging behind in the bench press, your triceps are going to stay as a relative weakness because the movement is not changing. You're failing to introduce specific overload to those muscle groups. So by making an exercise selection change, like switching to close grip bench for a period of time, you're going to be able to specifically overload that lagging musculature. And then when you come back to the competitive exercise, now the triceps are not going to be a relative weak point anymore. Over-application of variation is something that you're going to very often see, and this is usually my biggest criticism of conjugate style training. If you want to go more in depth there, Dr. Mike and I have a very extensive video critiquing a West Side Barbell system, and this is going to be, these points are going to be some of the main criticisms. So selecting exercise variations with a low transfer to the competitive exercise. As you get farther and farther away in any of these ways to create variation, you're going to have a lower degree of transfer, especially if they're being done, if those are always the exercises you're choosing and it's not being done strategically for just a portion of the training. So as you get into specialty bars and things that look less and less like the competitive exercise, they probably are going to have a lower and lower degree of transfer. Non-overloading variance. There are some exercises out there that just don't allow you to go heavy enough to create the stimulus that you need for strength adaptation. Dr. Mike, I've heard him say a lot of times, how many band pull-aparts do you have to do to bench 600? It's not that the band pull-apart is a bad exercise, but if you're using that as trying to use that as an overloading back exercise, it's probably a bad variation compared to something like bent over row or dumbbell row that allows for proper overload stimulus. Overhead squat is another one that comes to mind. Not that it's a bad exercise, but if your goal is to develop maximal strength in the squat, the overhead squat would be a variation that wouldn't allow you to properly overload. You just can't go heavy enough on it to make the improvements that you're looking to make. Exercises that are phase or goal inappropriate. So if I'm in the hypertrophy block, I want to choose exercises that allow for me to train for very high volumes, probably higher frequency. So high bar back squat is a great selection there compared to a low bar back squat. While if my goal is to develop technical prowess and the low bar back squat is my competition move, then that would be an appropriate variation for strength or peaking phases. In the same way, if my goal is to develop quad hypertrophy or specific quad strength, the low bar back squat would also be an inappropriate choice compared to a high bar back squat or a front squat. So you want to be choosing exercises strategically for your specific phase of training you're in and the specific goals that you have. Finally, and we mentioned this before, excessively frequent variation is going to be a negative because it's going to violate the idea of directed adaptation. Directed adaptation, again, is really working on one goal long enough to actually see some results in it and to be able to track your progress and say, this exercise helped me reach this goal or this exercise didn't help me reach this goal. But if you're changing exercises every single week, unless you are a very, very advanced lifter who is very, very good at tracking your progress, it's probably not going to be the best choice for you. So finally, just to wrap it up, proper application is going to mean properly timed variations. So farther away from a meet, you're doing more variations. As you get closer to the competition, you're having less and less variation. Again, the most specific exercise you can do, 1 rep max in the competitive exercise. So that's what you want to be doing when you get real close to competition. And then as you're farther away from competition, making those changes of loading strategy, exercise selection, tempo and velocity of the lifts to introduce variation to avoid staleness. And finally, strategic variations for phases or weaknesses. As we mentioned in over and under application, there are some exercises that are just better suited to different phases of training. There are some exercises that are better suited to bringing up specific weak points. So if you want to properly use variation, strategically select your exercise variation, critically think about why you're doing them, why is that exercise a good fit to the phase of training you're in. Make sure, if you're trying to bring up your triceps, that you're choosing exercises that are overloading the triceps, or whatever muscle group it is that you're trying to address. And that's the principle of variation. Make sure to check out the other videos in our series on specificity, overload, fatigue management, and the principle of SRA, and please subscribe to the channel.